All right, so I'm ready to go ahead and start. We'll call this recording a discussion of I believe this is chapter 10. We are doing comparative politics. When you read through the chapter, you'll see that the text is making an effort to compare world, systems, right? They're looking at, how legislatures, executives, and judicial branches work in various countries. That's why these three chapters are called comparative politics. Our goal in front of each other, our goal is to pay particular attention. I pretty much assume that you have read through the chapter. I wonder if that's a safe assumption, but that's my assumption, right? And then, that being the case, what it leaves for us to do is to talk about how these systems work in the United States, because you're reading about the international context. Now, looking at how these systems work in the United States, we accept that the US government is based on, proceeds from the US Constitution. And so the US Constitution is a document that is broken up. Hold on for a second. All right, here we go. Right, the U.S. Constitution is broken up into one preamble, 7 articles, and 27 amendments. You'll you'll read with me, and you'll find that Article 1 of the Constitution, Section 1, Clause 1 says legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. That means you will have a legislative branch, Article 1 of the Constitution. And then it says that your legislative branch will consist of a House and a Senate. You see bicameralism in Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Read with me, please, as we turn our attention to Article 2. Article 2 of the Constitution says executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. Article 2 then establishes the executive branch, the powers, the responsibilities, the eligibility requirements of the president. We'll talk about that. You'll go with me to Article 3 of the Constitution. Article 3 of the Constitution says judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court. So it says you will have a Supreme Court, and it also says Congress may from time to time ordain and establish inferior courts. So the Constitution leaves it to Congress to create a federal judiciary. What we just said was Article 1 details the legislative branch. Article 2 details the executive branch. Article 3 details the judiciary branch. When you put them all together, just like 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, when you put them all together, you get the concept, you get the constitutional principle of separation of powers. Separation of powers, where your federal government is divided into 3 branches. Let's pay some attention right now to the judicial branch. We'll start at Article 3 today. I want to ask you the question of whether or not the Supreme Court, the work of the Supreme Court, whether or not the judicial branch is an agent of inclusion, or if it works, is an agent of exclusion, whether or not the Supreme Court is working positively to affirm the civil rights of everyone in the United States, or whether or not the United States is instead an agent of discrimination, whether or not there's class bias in the job, in the work of the court system in the United States. Marbury versus Madison, so the fundamental Supreme Court decision. It was rendered in 1803. In Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court gives itself the power to interpret the Constitution with finality. The concept of judicial review proceeding from Marbury versus Madison is the most important principle of American jurisprudence. It is really how things work, right? And so judicial review means that the Supreme Court has the ability to look at a law passed by Congress and can determine whether or not that law is in line with the Constitution. And if it is not, the Supreme Court can tell the Congress it cannot do that thing that it says it wants to do. Judicial review on behalf of the Supreme Court says that, they can look at an action undertaken by the President of the United States, and they can determine whether or not that action is in line or out of step with the Constitution. Speaking of actions undertaken by the President, last night on Twitter, the President of the United States said that he's going to suspend all immigration into the United States to supposedly allow the country to handle the coronavirus. Is that legal? Is that constitutional? Well, we'll see. If someone sues him, which is quite likely, then, we'll see about that. So judicial review then means that the Supreme Court can look at actions undertaken by the president and reverse them or confirm them. That Supreme Court judicial review means the Supreme Court can look at actions undertaken by Congress and affirm or disqualify them. That means then that the Supreme Court, based on judicial review, is a check and a balance against the powers of the other two branches. Checks and balances implicit in judicial review. One last time, judicial review is defined as the Supreme Court is the final authority on the meaning of the Constitution. Well, on what basis does the Supreme Court render its decisions? How does the Supreme Court see itself as see its role rather in the American political system? Well, there are some factors that we can look at, right? Hopefully, various interpretations of the Constitution are the main factor influencing the work. I'm speaking of the Supreme Court here, right? Now, what we might also find is that the political party or the ideology of the Supreme Court justice is just as important a factor in determining how they're going to render their decisions than is any interpretation of the Constitution. And we can be clear. Republican presidents nominate conservative justices. And when those conservative justices take the bench, they render conservative decisions on the issues of the day. And that is the same thing for the liberal side. Democrats nominate liberal judges. And so perhaps then, just as important as the US Constitution, also important is the personal ideological judicial philosophy of the justice that is rendering the decision. Now, another factor influencing the court, we call it stare decisis, or let the decision stand. The Supreme Court says that if the circumstances of one case or of a current case are similar to the circumstances of a past case, then the past case should inform the current case. That means that precedent is just a fundamental way that the Supreme Court does its business, right? And then the social values of the times in which they live also influences the job of the Supreme Court. Now, if these things, if these things are at work, one has to wonder what kind of results come out of Supreme Court decisions. What is the result, right? And so this is a provocation I wanted to offer to you. What if there is indeed a class bias that is present in the criminal justice system? That would mean then that certain people are receiving the benefit of the law, and then other people are not receiving benefits, but other people are subjected to the law. Let's do some statistical analysis and see what we can do, right? One of your famous, you're one of my favorite rappers, right? Rakim Allah says that, We're going to do the actual facts and solar facts here and now, but we go so far back. So let's look at some criminal bias in the justice system. 2/3 of people who go to prison report that their annual income immediately prior to their arrest was $12,000. That then means that 2/3 of people that get arrested are underneath the poverty line. Once you go to prison, you don't just sit there and lift weights, right? Once you go to prison, there is a financial cost attached to the prisoner, various fines and fees and, costs for, various amenities, right? A bag of chips. And so if you cannot pay these fees and fines that, prisoners are made to pay to foot the bill for their own incarceration, then once that prisoner gets out of prison and finds themselves a job, the wages of that, released prisoner, ex-convict, the wages can be garnished. Many states require that someone recently released from prison can pay upwards of 35% of their weekly wages to various agencies after they get out. Indeed, a former inmate can be made to pay 4 or 5 departments at once, sometimes resulting in over 100% of their wages being garnished. Some states revoke driver's licenses, some states revoke voting rights. And if this is something that's happening to a group of people that go to prison when they are poor, and then when they get out, I don't know if, when you go to prison, you're poor, you get out of prison, you're still poor, right? Excuse me. And so once this happens, the question is how legal is it? Is this in line with the Constitution? Well, in recent decades, the Supreme Court has said, yes, this is in line with the Constitution. The Supreme Court has agreed to the legal rationale behind much of this. How is this possible? Let me pick up the pace a little bit. I think I'm awake now. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 78 looked at the relationship in the context of separation of powers, looked at the relationship between the Supreme Court and the other 2 branches of government. And in Federalist number 78, he famously said that the Supreme Court will have neither force nor will, merely judgment. That the Supreme Court is not going to be able to force anyone to do anything, right? That's the job of Congress because they make the laws. The Supreme Court will not have any will, meaning they won't do anything themselves. Remember, the executive branch or the presidency, that's the doing branch of government. But the power of the Supreme Court, according to Alexander Hamilton, the power of the Supreme Court is going to lie in its judgment. Judicial review then is the power that allows the Supreme Court to stand in as a co-equal branch of government. Neither force nor will, merely judgment. Now, let's look at the possibilities of bias. John Jay, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, the first Chief Justice of the country, John Jay once said, the people who own the country ought to govern the country. If you own the country, you can govern the country. Isn't it supposed to be some type of a Republican democracy? How is it possible then that someone can be in a position to own the country? Richard Hofstadter, in 1948, he wrote this book called The American Political System. I think I'm messing up the title. But Richard Hofstadter, that's a good book though. Richard Hofstadter once said, wherever the real power in a government lies, there is the danger of oppression. And in our government, the real power lies in the majority of the community. Excuse me. What he's arguing here is that the majority of the community are poor people. And so he says that the real power in the country lies in the hands of the masses of the people that are working and working class, middle class, and poor. And the danger of oppression there lies in the possibility that the poor and the working class would rise up and assert their redistributive claims on top of the wealthy. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my throat. And so let's go here, right? Where does the law come from? The law is a human invention. Things that come from human beings are the result of the perceived interests, the perceived needs, and the particularized actions of specific groups of people. So as we question the nature of the law, and as we talk about the judicial branch this day, we're asking the substantive question, which group develops the law? We say that the law is an instrument for placing the power of government behind the various practices that impacts people's lives. What if people's lives are fundamentally unequal? And then the law then, if it's the instrument that places the government behind that inequality, then the law does not dispel, dilute inequality. Perhaps the law concretizes inequality, makes the inequality more harsh than it might otherwise be. Let's again return to the criminal justice system. Many people who have a criminal record that shows up on a background check have never even been convicted of a crime. However, employers use the possibility of a criminal record to discriminate against 65 million Americans each year, potentially. Potentially. Right? So by discrimination, we're talking about employment discrimination. When employment discrimination amongst the poor becomes rampant, and when employers illegally, in many cases, subvert the law, then this unemployment becomes endemic, where endemic is another word for common, endemic. An industry has grown up around the criminal justice system, right? The prison industrial complex. And essentially, remember, we're saying that the vast majority of the people that go to prison are poor, and they were already suffering through the economic system. Federal, state, and local governments at one point were only spending $9 billion a year to, imprison people. Nowadays, it's up to $68 billion a year. We're talking large, big business. And so when an industry grows up around imprisoning the poor, the endemic unemployment then becomes enshrined in the systems at work. It becomes systemic. So systemic imprisonment and endemic unemployment cannot help but create a society that has fundamental inequalities at the core of its existence. And these inequalities have not necessarily been challenged by the legal system. It has been enshrined, it has been ironed in, concretized, baked in by successive Supreme Court decisions. I call your attention to this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois once said, "There is no reliable statistic to which one can safely appeal to measure exactly the growth of crime amongst the emancipated enslaved people." He's saying this in 1901. I'm questioning to you whether or not what he said in 1901 is still true in 2020. Du Bois said, "About 70% of all prisoners in the South are Black. This, however, is in part explained by the fact that accused Negroes are still easily convicted and get long sentences, while whites still continue to escape the penalty of many crimes, even amongst themselves." Du Bois here in 1901, a couple of years before he would famously say the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Du Bois tells us here that there is a racial factor to the way criminal justice is handled in the country. But then that's 100 years ago. That can't possibly be true now. Well, of course, I wouldn't have brought it up if it wasn't, right? And so the African American population, depending on the count, is around 13% of the larger American population. However, Black people wind up being 46% of everybody that's in prison. 46% of inmates are Black. 41% of people that are awaiting trial are Black. 42% of people on death row are Black. However, 13% of the country is black. That means then that black people are suffering disproportionate to our population in the country. All right, middle income whites are approximately 75 to 80% of drug users, according to the ACLU, a study from more than a decade ago. However, once you put blacks and Latinos together, blacks and Latinos represent approximately 22% of drug users. So black people and Latino people, 22% of drug users. However, blacks and Latinos are 37% of those arrested, 59% of those convicted, and 74% of those receiving prison sentences. Let's do some more numbers. Looking at FBI reports, 69% of those who are arrested are white, and 28% of those who are arrested are black. Blacks and whites, depending on a few hundred, commit murder. I think that's roughly the same rate, but 5,300 murders are committed by whites, 5,900 murders are committed by blacks. 65% of whites are arrested for rape, 32% of blacks are arrested for rape. 61% of racial hate crimes are committed by whites, and black people wind up being 72% of the victims. So there is a racial character to the nature of crime in the country. Right? Let's look at some more statistics, right? The National Survey on Drug Use said that 11% of whites use illegal drugs underneath the age of 17, compared to 9% of blacks. Whites aged 12 to 17 are 33% more likely to have sold drugs than black youth. Looking at this other survey, white students annually use cocaine 4.6 times the rate of African American students. Whites use crack cocaine 1.5 times the rate of black students. Whites use heroin the same rate of black students, and white youths report annual use of marijuana 46% higher than black youth. So the picture I'm painting for you here with these numbers is that white people and black people, let's say it this way, that white people use more drugs and sell more drugs than do black people. However, black youth are arrested for drug offenses twice the rate of whites. Black youth represent nearly half of all youth that are incarcerated for a drug offense. There is an inequality there. I'm laying the numbers on heavy this morning. Let's do some more. You look at the CDC annual youth risk behavior survey that's done. The latest one online nowadays is from 2017, right? Whites and blacks report similar rates of carrying a weapon. Whites and blacks report similar rates of carrying, in particular, a gun. However, African American youth represent 32% of all weapon arrests, and black youth were arrested for weapons offenses at twice the rate of whites, 69 per 100,000 versus 30 per 100,000. Black students report being in a physical fight at a similar rate of whites, 36 versus 32%. I guess that's kind of similar. However, black youth were arrested for aggravated assault at a rate nearly 3 times that of whites. The question is, what kind of bias do these numbers represent? And is the Supreme Court the instrument of this bias, or is the Supreme Court helping to dispel this bias? One more time, where does the law come from? Well, the law comes from the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is the basis for the law. However, that's not the only place that law comes from, right? Laws are of course, written by the federal legislature. We're talking about the House of Representatives and the Senate. The laws are also written by state legislatures. The law is also written by, or developed at least by, bureaucracies. Remember that when Congress writes a law, it is often not practical for them to spell out literally every element of how that law should be implemented. And so what they wind up doing is leaving a certain amount of discretion to the bureaucracy to create rules, code, procedures to implement those laws. And those rules and procedures constitute administrative law, right? Judicial decisions. Remember, Supreme Court justices write opinions to talk about why they rendered the decision that they did, and those judicial opinions become law. We also just said, remember that the Trump administration this day is looking to, I guess I just took it off, but the Trump administration this day is looking to suspend all immigration into the United States by executive order. So an executive order is, again, a source of law. What kind of bias then is implicit in these various sources of law? Well, let's quote some sources. Let's quote some authorities. Blackstone's commentaries, right? A fundamental legal analysis that provide the basis for the law during the colonial time of the country. And remember, the colonial laws often turned right into being state laws, and state law provides the basis after the writing of the US Constitution for federal law. So Blackstone commentaries then provides the basis for American law. Inside Blackstone's commentaries, the line is, so great is the regard of the law for private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it. No, not even for the common good of the whole community. Blackstone's commentary says that the law is designed to protect private property. Let's go to Adam Smith, the father of laissez-faire capitalism. Adam Smith, who wrote the famous book, The Wealth of Nations, where he talked about the invisible hand of market forces and self-interest setting prices and such. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, once said, till there be property, there can be no government, the very end of which is to secure wealth and to defend the rich from the poor. Wait a minute, Adam Smith. What is the goal of government? He said the goal of the government is to secure the wealth. And the goal of the government is to what? Defend the rich from the poor. Let's turn our attention to the British utilitarian philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. He once said, property and the law are born together. They must die together. Before the law, there was no property. You take away the law, all property ends. What then, according to Jeremy Bentham, is the purpose of the law? It is to protect private property. What is the purpose of the law, according to Adam Smith? To defend the rich from the poor. Defend what? Defend their private property. According to Blackstone's commentaries, what is the goal? What is the purpose of the law? The law exists to protect private property. Congress writes the laws. The executive branch enforces the law. The bureaucracy interprets the law. Rather, the judicial branch interprets the law. Where does the law come from? It comes from the government. However, the government is influenced by large-scale transnational corporations and powerful interest groups, and their interests are at work when the law is written. If our authorities tell us that the law is designed to protect private property, then our goal is to look at what types of economic and corporate forces are influencing the development of the law in current circumstances. And so let's look at this, right? I'm turning your attention to, what is this? The sixth bullet point. In 2014, $3.2 billion was spent to lobby the federal government. And this number, over $3 billion spent every year, this exists from 2014 all the way up to last year. In 2019, the Center for Democracy, right? I forget the name of the group, but they conduct the webpage opensecrets.org. And they tell us that in 2019, $3.5 billion is spent to influence the development of the law. It's spent to lobby the government. I'm about to end this session because the timer is clicking down on me, but this is a good point for me to start off with the next class before we talk about some civil rights and the law. But I want to conclude this way. I want you to ask yourself, how much money have you as an individual spent to lobby the government? Then ask yourself, how much money has your family Not even your nuclear family. I'm talking about your long lost cousin. I'm talking about your great uncle that lives in the Caribbean. I'm talking about the grandmother that was part Native American, right? She has some, you got some Cherokee in you, of course, right? When you collect your whole family, I want you to ask, how much money has your whole family? We don't have to stop at the family. I want you to take a look at the neighborhood in which you live. Look at the communities in which you live, right? And then look at these things across racial and class lines. I want you to think about how much money you and everybody that lives around you and everybody that looks like you, how much money have you folks spent to influence the development of the law? How much money have you spent to lobby the government? Perhaps you'll find that it does not match up at all to that $3.5 billion that is spent on behalf of, in particular, large scale corporations to lobby the government. So if you and everyone that looks like you and everyone that lives next to you are not spending money to lobby the government, and these corporate interests are spending $3.5 billion in 2019 to lobby the government, then the question is clear. Who's the government existing for? Who's the government working for? Who's benefiting from these laws? All right. You might find then that you have a reason for, there's a reason why you should be more politically engaged than you might likely be, right? Because if the government is not existing to serve you, then maybe it's existing to subjugate you. I'm just trying to be provocative here a little bit. All right, so that's it. I'm gonna stop talking right now. I'm gonna end this recording. Thank you for attending. We'll call this part one. Part two coming up at 9. Part two coming